Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. So in the judge test result part 2, me and Muti are going to explain about the debate exhibition result. So we will start with the tipping points or the clashes on why certain team wins, and then later on we would brief you the scores on each speakers, why the first speaker of the affirmative gets this, why the third speaker of the negative gets that score, or why does the government reply and the negative reply get that score. We're going to brief that immediately in this debate exhibition result. So without further ado, let's go to the first part. So the result is as follows. We came up with a unanimous decision. We gave the winning towards the opposition bench. So it was an opposition debate. So congratulations for the opposition team. Now let's go with the tipping points. So the first tipping point is which side that can provide the better protection for the children. In this tipping point or clash, so government came up in this debate by saying that there is a sense of protection in the form of preventing the hostility, prevention on the physical abuse against the child, and etc. But unfortunately, in the affirmative side of the house, there is a bare minimum explanation on why children will be the number one target of that hostility by the majority. There is never any explanation coming from the affirmative as to why the majority have that genuine malicious intention to attack these children. In comparison, comparatively, negative team managed to frame the identity building as a kid as the most or the more visible form of protection. The second speaker and the third speaker managed to explain that when you tell your kids that it's okay to wear hijab, it's okay for you to wear your ethnic attributes, it teaches the children to be very unapologetic and also gain their strength based on their identity. And also this becomes the inherent power for them to battle or to overthrow the identity crisis that is given to them. And also they believe that it's okay for them to be themselves unapologetically, because that's the true sense of protection that you can give towards the children, because that internal protection or affirmation is more realistic rather than expecting the external protection from the world. So in this one, at the very least, negative team shows that there is a sense of certainty on the protection in comparison to the affirmative side. Because unfortunately, despite the potential ideas about protection brought by the affirmative team, but the clarity, the illustration, or even the sense of certainty on their protection was not really given in the debate. So that's the reason why under this one, it falls under opposition or the negative side of the house. Next slide. So B, let's talk about the harm versus benefit of that protection. Affirmative came up and say that if you're not publicly expressing a certain trait, that means that you will blend in with the majority, igniting a certain tolerance for the majority. This was a very compelling point. However, the questions are two. Number one, what is the likelihood of that tolerance coming from the majority? It was not really mechanized in the debate by the affirmative team, because there is a huge question coming from us as to why staying silent will all of a sudden result in a sense of acceptance, result in a sense of tolerance for the minority, because there is a minimum rebuild brought by the second speaker and also the third speakers in the idea of tolerance, despite the potential idea brought by the first speaker. The question remains on how tolerance for the minority religion will be built. So that's the downfall of that idea of blending in and also the tolerance. Comparatively, in the negative side of the house, they have managed to explain, even in the worst case scenario, they believe that even in the worst case, there is still a display of sentiment, there is still a display of resistance or even hostility brought by majority. It's totally fine under several reasons. Number one, they believe that expression of religion protects the sanctity of the religion. Secondly, they also believe that by not denying the practice of faith, they believe that it might result into a certain cognitive dissonance. So they believe practice of faith is necessary, or else cognitive dissonance might happen. They also believe that there is an internal community that may give them like a source of strength, the source of protection, or even the source of safe space for them to put a certain public expression of their faith, be it wearing hijab or wearing cross necklace or even putting tattoos or many more public expression that is accessible by the children from the minority religion background. They are also able to point out that it's quite assumptive for the government to blanketly think that staying silent means that you are fully granted with the acceptance coming from the society. Meanwhile, most of the time, the religious attribute is unable to be hidden, right? Because they believe that it's not only tattoos or cross necklace that are visible as a form of public expression. They believe that something more like name, compulsory attribute like hijab and etc. is something that is also visible as a religious attribute, and it has been clarified since the LO speech, and they believe that it is unable to be hidden. It is by default there. So it's kind of hard to give the sense of protection or let alone the acceptance coming from the society. So that's the reason why under the engagement to the worst case scenario, that's the first one. And secondly, under the mechanization and also the attempt to put a detailed explanation, that's the reason why UP took the win in this particular clash. Next one. Yeah, now let's talk about the second clash. So after winning the first clash, the second clash is about which side that can fulfill the parents' pious responsibility as a religious parents and also for the internal religious community. Affirmative side has quite a bare minimum exploration on the idea of parents' pious interest. Meanwhile, negative team managed to clarify that this is the burden of the parents, right? Especially in these religious community, to make sure that the children reach a certain level of piety for the sake of their afterlife, or getting the sense of peace, getting the sense of belonging towards their religion, for a deeper interest for the religious community. These are the parental rights or parental responsibilities that are standardized and unable to be abandoned from the internal religious community itself. Unfortunately, affirmative side of the house did not manage to explain on what kind of interest does the parents want, because the only thing that they explained is about the protection, right? In this one, the reason why UP wins or negative team wins was because of negative team can illustrate why the responsibility of staying pious or why the responsibility of maintaining a certain level of piety for the sake of a tangible benefit for the children, that is the afterlife reward. That's the reason why upside wins under one. On the significance behind the parents' responsibility, they can prove that piety can outweighs the benefit of the protection. Secondly, they also believe that afterlife reward, which is the tangible benefit of the children, is crucial rather than the protection that is still uncertain and also not proven by the affirmative team. So that's the first part why opposition won the second clash. The second part will be explained by Muti.
All right, thank you so much, Kachia, for the amazing explanation. I'm going to try to continue that for the second tipping points in the second clash. Just a minute. Okay. So the second tipping points in regards to explaining about parental pious responsibilities, that within that government side of the house or affirmative side of the house, at some certain level, actually managed to explain that discouraging your child to publicly practice the religion is actually an integral step to avoid the children from having stereotype or scrutiny to the faith or their parents that belongs to them when aggression happens, right? So they basically explain that when you are protecting your children from bullies by making sure that they are only practicing their religion privately, for example, this is also preventing them from having certain sentiment towards you as a parent and also towards their religion, for example, by questioning whether or not my religion is truly the essentials to begin with or not, right? So they basically say that if bullying exists under opposition, the children will not hate their peers, but rather because they are still irrational, they will hate or turn their back against their parents or the religion in itself, which is something that governments of the house obviously want to prevent to begin with, right? However, we think that this very good and also potential analysis is still quite asymmetrical in responses, because the security measures that governments out of the house take means that they want to protect their children by hiding, for example, or by privately practicing this religion. And this is still not crystallized as to how they're going to secure the livelihood of these children in this way, right? Because at the end of the day, just like Kachia have already mentioned before, this is still not answering why then not wearing your attributes will suddenly equals immunity from the bullying or hostility or sentiment in your side of the house as the government team, right? Furthermore, this alternative that governments brought on how private expression gives more meaning and also internalization of your faith also creates two major questions that are left unanswered until the end of the debate, which is firstly, in regards to meaning and internalization of the value of the religion, Why then, or what is the picturization as to why this is something that is more important or can overthrow the pious responsibility of the parents to begin with? Why then this internalization, for example, can suddenly result in a long-term piety of the children or the sustainability of that religious community to begin with? We think that there is still quite bare minimum link back into what kind of internalization of religion that they want on the children. And secondly, the manifestation of this benefit, for example, even if you're able to create more meaning and also internalization for the children, the moment you ask them to private or just use their personal religious attributes privately, what is the manifestation of this to begin with? Is it only protection, or is it only security, or is there any parental responsibility or interest that also entrenched inside of this thing to begin with, which is still quite blurry under the side of government? That is the second tipping points in the second clash, why we give it to opposition side of the house instead, right? Now to the third classes, in the question about which side can establish a better parental relationship with the children, right? So there are several tipping points in this clash. Firstly, the main reason why opposition team wins this clash is because we think that opposition can draw the blessings in disguise in their worst case scenario, right? So in the worst case scenario, oppression will still exist, hostility will still exist, bullying to the children coming from the majority to this minority religion children will still exist, right? But reacting to the possible worst case scenario, opposition has mentioned about how this kind of bullying and how this aggression actually influences the parents to have an automated bigger responsibility to protect the children and to rationalize the oppression rather than validating the oppression by staying silent and also only privately practicing the religion, right? Which amplifies the oppression, and parents will be seen as complicit with by no response to begin with, right? This is also a very good pointing out, also being done by opposition side of the house, because they managed to flip the logic that is being brought by government side of the house, that in government team, the children will turn their back against their parents instead, and they will hate the religion and the parents instead, because the parents and the religion values in itself will be seen as complicit with no kind of stand up for these children to begin with, right? This is the harm in government, that children will have a sense of doubt to the religion and also the parents due to the silence, that being seen as complicit, for example. And this is inherently giving confirmation bias to the bullies of these children, that aggression against your religious identity is something that is justified, something that's okay, because the fact is not even your parents would stand up for your condition, for example, being aggressed every single day in schools and whatnot, right? Comparatively, under opposition side of the house, the relationship among parents and children will be better and more solid in due to three reasons, right? Firstly, because there's going to be a consistent teaching to prevent cognitive dissonance that might come towards these irrational children to begin with, right? There's going to be a consistent teaching about what it means to wear hijab, what your name actually means, for example, these religious attributes that are inseparable from you to begin with, preventing you from having doubts or like building sentiments or hatred against your parents or the religion in itself, because they are actually not complicit or like silent against the oppression that you have to accept as a children, for example. Secondly, parents can also teach quote-unquote superhero narrative, because they can portray themselves as their children's soul protector, having their children look up more to them, for example, gaining respect and attachment in the process, for example, because you are seen as the protector and someone that's willing to stand up for your children and the religious attributes, for example. And last but not least, they also mentioned that basically being discriminated is a blessing in disguise for the parents and children relationship, because inside of it, there's going to be a discourse about what it means to practice our religion, for example. What does it mean to have certain identity or certain beliefs as a religious community? That is only going to happen if this kind of issues is actually being brought to the surface, is actually being talked over dinner, for example, something that is impossible under the word of government side of the house, because they are going to be staying silent and staying private about everything, for example, right? So this is actually a blessing in disguise for the parents-children relationship, because now they have a heart-to-heart discourse, heart-to-heart talk, for example, dinner talk, for example, something that is going to be better for the relationship if there is a healthy communication inside of it to begin with, right? Just a minute. And the second tipping points in this third clash is that we think that opposition managed to explain why preventing children from changing religion and hating you as a parent is only feasible if you're actually letting them to have, like what Kachia said, right? Certain level of expression of religious beliefs to begin with, right? This is a very important tipping point, because this tipping point, we feel that this is independent from any scenario, regardless of whether or not showing your religious attribute will be beneficial or will be safe, will be resulting in protection and whatnot. But there is a burden that the parents needs to take, which is the burden of legacy. This particular thing, or like teaching or belief, need to be continuous for it to become beneficial for the parental children relationship, for them to not, have a growing doubts or growing sentiment against the parents or the religion to begin with, right? The response coming from government side of the house was about how public expression and showing nobility to the other religion is a suicidal move, especially in conservative area. For example, they were also talking about Aceh and whatnot. Even though the assertion was potential, we feel like it is not answering why then the severity of discrimination will be lessened or eliminated by discouraging the children's public expression of faith. So not only that the response was quite insufficient to neutralize opposition's case about expression, but also it affirmed the worst case of opposition and its benefit, right? Regarding of how privately practicing your religion will not result in any kind of prosperity for the children's and parents' relationship. This is not going to change any conservatism that might exist in certain demography or areas and whatnot. So I feel that opposition can also take this third clash in regards to things like parental relationship with the children and whatnot, right? Okay, now that we've talked about the tipping points and clashes as to why this debate becomes an opposition debate, let's talk about the speaker scoring for the individuals in the debate. So yeah. So as for the speaker scoring, we give 75 to 76 for the first speaker of affirmative, 73 for first speaker opposition, 76 to 77 for the second speaker of affirmative team, 78 for second speaker of opposition team, third speaker affirmative got 73, third speaker of opposition got 78, and 38 for government reply, and 38.5 for opposition reply. So for the first speaker of affirmative, there's a range between 75 to 76. Firstly, I'm going to explain as to why it is okay to give the first speaker affirmative 75 for 4 reasons. Firstly, we feel there is a quite big assumptions, especially in the setup that is being brought by the first speaker of affirmative. Firstly, in regards to how religious attributes is always optional, the assumptions that religious attributes is only limited to things like tattoos or necklaces, cross necklace, for example, or like talking privately and have a heart-to-heart talk about your religious struggle to your friends and whatnot, but never actually really talk or like discuss about the compulsory attributes that are unable to be hidden. We're talking about things like hijab or undebatable identities such as your names that might have religious resonance to it, for example. And secondly, the assumption that religion is exclusively only about praying to God, but quite defensive or highly defensive that self-expression is never a legitimate way to practice religion. And these assumptions makes the setup hardly nuanced throughout the opposition speech to begin with, right? Second reason as to why it's okay to give the Prime Minister 75 is because we feel that the biggest benefit in which about protection for the children is quite not mechanized, is hardly mechanized, because it's quite hard to see why then doing prayers or like why then practicing your religion behind closed doors will suddenly turn into tolerance. That's the first thing. And even if it is able to be explained that this is going to turn into tolerance, why then the tolerance or acceptance won't be tokenistic coming from the majority to begin with, right? I'm sorry. The third reason is because there is a quite simplistic comparative by not giving differentiation, for example, of the kind of discrimination if the child remains silent, or the discrimination that might happen if the children is expressing themselves religiously. The lack of comparative also in assuming that the internal community of religion in opposition will always be weak and incomparable with the support coming from majority, for example, and this make affirmative's own analysis about majority tolerance becomes questionable, for example, because there is a simplistic comparative, for example, about the discrimination and about the internal community and external majority to begin, right? Lastly, however, why this still needs to be scored as average is due to several things that we can appreciate from the speech coming from Prime Minister. Is because firstly, there is a good characterization of how religion should be personal, for example, and why this personal practice can shift the mindset of the majority slowly, for example, can actually slowly and organically build that kind of tolerance, knowing that this minority religion is actually peaceful. They are not in any way seeking violence and things like that, and they are actually a very very peaceful and a very kind religious community, for example. There is also a sufficient picturization of why religious community will have a far stronger attachment if we pray privately, because there is communal struggles that can be shared inside of this community, making it even easier for them to become more solid, for example. And also there is a very good and extensive link back as to why protecting the children from stereotypes and giving them safety net against stigmatization can benefit their growth a lot when they have to adapt themselves in the real world. There is a good extensive link back and also analysis about how this safety net can actually turn into strength, into confidence that these children might develop later on when they become an adult and whatnot, right? So that those are the reasoning as to why the first speaker of affirmative can get 75 in the debate. Now to the second thing, right? Why then first speaker affirmative can also get 76 in this debate, right? Several reasons. Firstly, because we feel that the setup was actually quite or like slightly better than average, because at least Prime Minister are able to set up parents' interest of protection for the children, or they can also create a setup about which country will this motion most likely operates on, what does the society in that country actually looks like, how do they behave, how do they socialize, and also how extensive is the degree of discrimination in state societies against these children coming from minority religious communities. Secondly, Prime Minister is also able to establish a sense of urgency about why self-actualization and individual connection with God should be done in the most safest manner. For example, thus discouraging the children is the last resort to reach that level of safety net, for example, right? But detached with probability of discrimination. However, it also still doesn't fully prove the safety, because source of unsafe feeling will still exist regardless of whether or not you're showing your religious attributes. For example, if your parents actually, not your parents, if your peers actually know about your religion, for example, and they still harass you because of that, although this is a very good analysis, but also still there is a bare minimum analysis as to why the safety, will suddenly become absolute if the unsafe feeling will still exist regardless, right? But thirdly, but even with those set up, we still had questions left unanswered that that cannot make us give the Prime Minister higher than 76, which is firstly, is it true that protection is parents' only interest? This is then questioned also by opposition by asserting that parents also have religious interests, and there is a bare minimum response to parents' religious interests coming from government team. Secondly, how likely is the said discrimination happen to children, and how likely are children to be discriminative to other children, knowing that they are still, very much irrational, they don't even understand or like still entrenched or like internalized yet the value of religion or what it is to be a religious community and whatnot. Thirdly, even if not, then who are the actors who would discriminate against these innocent children, for example, and why, like Achia said previously, why then they would be the #1 target of all of this aggression? And to conclude, although Prime Minister are able to goodly explain that there is a degree of discrimination, they are still unable to establish the likelihood of discrimination and what is the manifestation for these children to begin with, right? Now let's talk about first speaker of position and why leader of position got 73. Several reasons. Firstly, because we feel there is a lacking in importance behind most of the main ideas that are offered by leader of position. For example, the ideas of easier detection of other children with the same identity if they are wearing hijabs, for example, or wearing like religious attributes. We feel that there is still a lack of importance as to why this detection is the most important analysis in the debate, or for example, the analysis about having stronger community and safe space. Why then it is exclusive and only important under the word of position and not going to be achieved in the word of government side of the house that already champion also the idea of communal grievances and whatnot, right? Secondly, the potential harm in leader opposition speech was quite not well magnified. For example, the analysis or like the harm about hiding the expression will make you feel left out and make the oppressor even more invisible. We feel there is some bare minimum explanation about the comparative, why then the oppressor will not feel more invincible, and why then the oppression will suddenly stop if you're just proudly using your religious attributes under the word of opposition. That reason is because we feel that the idea of a breaking wall of stigma or oppression was not really backed up with mechanization, so there's still missing link to the word or like to the goal that is being envisioned by the opposition side of the house. And last but not least is because we feel that there is an insufficient response to a lot of prime minister's cases, for example, in regards to safe connection with private expression or safety net is a justified reason to trade off public expression, or the you can gain more meaning by having private expression and also better internalization of the religious values for children and whatnot. We feel that there is still a quite lacking response to all of these cases from the prime ministers, hence the score 73. Now for the second speaker of affirmative, there is also a range for this, ranging from 76 to 77. If you give it 76, it's totally okay because several reasons. Firstly, because we feel that there are lots of arguments and contexts left with no elaborative conclusion, and it impacted the importance and significance of such arguments, for example, right? For example, when talking about conservatism areas or about protecting these children in this very, very, crucial demography and whatnot, the question then becomes, how is it in line with the parents' interest, for example, or what is the manifestation of this to begin with? And secondly, we also feel that Deputy Prime Minister still hasn't answered the hanging burden from Prime Minister on step-by-step analysis of how this proposal could directly result to protection in form of acceptance. Just like what Kak Chia have already explained before, there's still a unanswered question as to why then privately practicing your religion will suddenly be turned or like suddenly result in acceptance, and why this kind of acceptance and tolerance will not be tokenistic and will be ideal under the word of government side of the house. And last but not least, because we feel that there is a minimal explanation on how the extension relate to the entire debate. For example, there's a very good analysis and good argument about closeted religion that are inherently private, that are inherently not necessarily silent, but they are practicing their religion privately, like the Amish community, for example. But we feel that this extension it's quite hard to find the link back for this to the entire debate as to why then the practice religion of the Amish community needs to be the standard of every other minority religion practices, for example, in the debate, right? So this is the reasonings as to why second speaker of affirmative can get 76. But second speaker of affirmative can also get 77 for several reasons, right? Firstly, because we feel that there is a very good extension by explaining a wider spectrum of discrimination, something that is still missing in the word of Prime Minister, right? Second speaker of affirmative actually managed to characterize that what will happen if the attribution is either detectable or not, that there is a wider characterization in regards to if the attributes status is optional, like cross necklace, for example, and it is not optional like hijab, it is not optional like names, for example. There is a good extension in picturizing this to begin with. And secondly, that there is also a very good macro analysis that are, we think, very extensive by explaining that not only how this discrimination operate on grassroots level, but to the extent of explaining how politician behavior and political climate will most likely improve if we practice our religion in private. This is a very good extension also coming from Deputy Prime Minister. Thirdly, there is an additional responses by filling in why the discrimination will most likely happen regardless of how religious the state is. So again, this is an extension coming from the conservatism that has been explained by Prime Minister by creating more characterization regardless of this conservatism, why the discrimination will still most likely happen to this minority religion, for example. And this is very important to compensate Prime Minister's lack of likelihood of why discrimination will happen mainly to the children, exactly because they're the most vulnerable, they're easiest to turn against certain beliefs, and these are the characterization that are being added by the Deputy Prime Minister. Last but not least, because we feel that there is a sufficient additional setup by mechanizing how the internal communities union and discourse will operate and become stronger if there is a communal grievances, communal sadness, for example, and that will result or like translate into communal solidarity in the internal community to begin with, right? So that's it for the second speaker of affirmative. Now, for the second speaker of opposition, there's no range. We give 78 for the deputy leader of opposition under several reasons. Firstly, because we feel that second speaker of opposition are able to mechanizing government's biggest missing points in regard to happiness and fulfillment by firstly questioning why the best and worst case of government will result in happiness. So even in the best case scenario, it does result in protection. It does result in the children not being bullied, for example. Why then this is an exclusive translation of happiness and fulfillment if the children is not being bullied or like not being oppressed, for example. But secondly, also answering why fulfillment is exclusive through proudly embracing expression and expressing your belief, for example, by being unapologetic of wearing your hijab, by being unapologetic of your names, for example, that contains religious attachment and whatnot. Why then the fulfillment and happiness will only exist in this rather than expecting the external protection coming from majority. But secondly, we think that there was also very good clarification that this is specifically an actor debate that heavily relies on the parents' interests and characterize the pious interests of parents and what is ethical for these parents. Why then parents have much more, larger interests that ranges not only to protect their children, but also this protection can be translated multidimensionally. Some can say that this protection can only be in form of the children not being bullied, but Deputy Leader Opposition managed to extend it by saying that this interest of protection can also be in form of protection in the afterlife, for example, something that is quite left unmechanized under the word of government side of the house. Thirdly, that there is a great analysis of why the relationship among the parents and children will be much better and why this relationship is the independent tipping point that needs to be counted the most. So regardless of whether or not the children will be protected at the end of the day, there's a good analysis as to why the solidarity of this relationship is very important to not create things like cognitive dissonance, to make sure that the children will not quote unquote doubt the values of the religion or like the teachings of the parents and whatnot and hate the religion and the parents instead. And this is an independent clashes or like tipping point and contribution that needs to be counted the most. And last but not least, that there is a better mechanization about protection as opposed to the mechanization that is being brought by leader opposition as to why protection comes from these children not feeling alienated and whatnot, and why then this internal protection of confidence, of embracing your identity, of like not being sorry about who you are is much more realistic and much more feasible rather than the external protection coming from the majority that is, quite left unmechanized also, but why then the acceptance will suddenly happen, just like what we've already explained before. For the third speaker of affirmatives and opposition, also for the reply speeches, will be delivered by Kachia.
All right, thank you, Muti. All right, so for the third speaker of affirmative, so the speaker got 73 was because of four main reasons. The first one was because, unfortunately, the role fulfillment was not really executed well. There was minimum responses towards the multiple fresh ideas from DLO because the strategy made by the third speaker affirmative was rather rebuilding every single thing that has been brought by the PM and also the DPM or the first and the second speaker affirmative. But unfortunately, that rebuild attempt was not really successful because some ideas were repetitive to the PM and also the PM speech. For example, about the idea of more severe discrimination that would occur with the public expression of faith, and also the religion will only become the individual connection between individual and God. Therefore, hiding it and not showing it publicly is something that is okay because it's not necessary to put it in a public expression without necessarily explaining to us as to how there is a translation of security on that point, because there is no attempt on added explanation or even added nuance or even elevation to the point of the individual connection. Thus, that's the reason why the contribution was considered repetitive towards the first speaker and the second speaker of affirmative. Thirdly, was because of this. There is actually a good attempt coming from the third speaker of the affirmative in showing why reaching individual fulfillment is more prioritized rather than gaining positive public perception. But unfortunately, this idea about individual fulfillment, despite the potential, despite the importance, it is left unexplored in the third speaker's speech earlier. So that's the reason why the speaker cannot even get higher score rather than 73. Last of all was because of there are several help stances idea. Say, for example, discouraging is not mandatory, despite the fact that the motion clearly stated that affirmative team needs to fully state that discouraging is mandatory and what is the philosophical reasons or the principal reasons or even what is the benefit that will be gained by discouraging the children coming from the minority background to not express their religion publicly, for example. They also managed to say that discouraging is not mandatory, but it's for the safety net, without necessarily explaining to us as to why safety net can only be gained through discouraging the public expression of faith. So that's the reason why the third speaker of affirmative gets 73 rather than the other scores. Next. Yeah, now let's go to the third speaker of the negative team. The speaker gets 78 was because of three main reasons. The first one was because the role fulfillment was fully executed well by providing like a clear picturization of framework or a clear frame of how the debate should be judged or operated from the parents' interest. The speaker believes that the parents are religious and also wants to have religious kids, right? And it is pointed out that this was mostly missing in government's analysis in the debate earlier, because government side did not even manage to prove what is the parents' interest on what kind of context that we are talking about on the parents. And that's the thing that is capitalized by the third speaker of the opposition, saying that religious parents, of course, they want religious kids. Therefore, public expression is the only way for them to inherit the religious compliance or even the religious attachment of the children. They also believe that preserving the religious identity is something that is important as a religious parents. Therefore, that's the reason why public expression should not be discouraged. Secondly, is that the third speaker of the opposition re-established a certain multiple harms that have been asserted by the opposition's case. For example, they believe that kids cannot establish a strong identity in the future, and the speaker also believed that the benefit of pandering to the majority is also questionable, and also there is a limited manifestation on the benefit of the government. For example, bringing the example of Rocky Girl. So on that point, the re-establishment of the multiple harms shows that there is a huge attempt of the third speaker of the opposition in magnifying the harm even further. So that attempt in magnifying the harm succeeded in the debate. So it is fully convincing, and it has made the judge give the tipping point towards the opposition. And last of all is that the third speaker is really helpful in providing the integral tipping point in the debate for the judges by saying that which side can parents be more in control of the children's faith. And this one, this becomes the independent clash that automatically goes to the opposition, regardless from the best and the worst case of hostility, because this is a standalone principle that has not been addressed or even attacked by the affirmative side of the house, and it has been capitalized by the third speaker of the opposition. And the speaker managed to show why this standalone principle is crucial to give the winning towards the opposition team. So that's the reason why third speaker from the opposition deserves 78. And yeah, so that's for the score. Next, for the reply speaker. Let's start with the opposition reply. So the opposition reply deserves 38.5 was because of three reasons. The first one is that there is a clear mapping out for the debate because the speaker analyzes the debate from a various perspective, for example, like child's protection, pious parents' interest, and also the parental attachment. Secondly, the speaker also did a good job in pointing out the missing links in the government side for each of the clash. For example, on the comparative of protection with the tipping points why Gov lose, or the actor debate. This is an actor debate, so they have managed to show why the interest of the parents is much more important rather than the other things that are being concerned by the Gov's case. And also, third of all, on the possibility of cognitive dissonance, something that has not been attacked or addressed fully by the affirmative team. Thirdly, was because of this. The opposition reply was able to punctuate the highlights of the ops team's contribution. For example, by showing why the children's protection and also development will be better under their side. And secondly, why the misunderstanding of structurized oppression will only lead to a certain hatred against the belief and also the parents, and how in ops case they will strengthen the bond with the children through the protector narrative and etc. In this one, opposition manages to show why parents will be much more functional if they have this certain protector narrative, or the parents are functional to be the protector of the children should any possible discrimination exist, and it is not being hidden due to the public expression of faith that is being channeled by the children coming from the minority background, that might spark a certain sentiment, that might spark a certain hostility and such. And that's when the needs of the protection or the sense of urgency of that protection is important, and they manage to prove why under that worst case scenario there is a blessing in disguise for the parents, and that is to make the parents to have that ability of protecting the children and making the parents be a functional parents for the children, and that's strengthening and also magnifying the relationship between the parents and also the children. So that's the reason why opposition reply deserves 38.5 and not the other score. Next. Now for the affirmative reply gets 38 under three main reasons. The first one is that the government reply was able to highlight the team's biggest contribution by assessing why showcasing or expressing the religious attributes most of the time is not linear with the acceptance for the minority. In this case, at the very least, government reply was able to show why the expression of the religious attributes is not backed up with a good feedback or with a good significance for the children from the minority background, and instead they will only get certain things such as backlash, hostility, sentiment, or even resistance, which is not even in line with the acceptance. And that acceptance becomes the prerequisite of the security of the children that has been illustrated by the affirmative team in the debate earlier. Second reason why government reply gets 38 was because of this. The government reply gives a good assessment of why the ops benefit might be huge, but not always accessible or targeted to niche actors only. They managed to show that the strong religious community can only be accessed by the middle to higher class religious communities. So on this point, at the very least, government side of the house was able to point out the flaw coming from the opposition bench under the idea of accessibility, because unfortunately in ops case there is never any explanation on why there is a widespread access of the benefit under the idea of sense of peace and etc. Last of all is this. The government reply was able to give sufficient comparative of what might or might not happen if the minority religious children are able to blend in with the vast majority, even though there is already an explanation or there is a sufficient comparative. But the main reason why government reply could not get higher ranks or higher scores than 38 was because of this. Because the analysis on the minority religious children being able to blend in was not really backed up with a good analysis. And unfortunately, the government reply also did not manage to show why blending in is not only possible in terms of likelihood, and secondly, what is the manifestation of benefit that they will get once they blend in with the majority. So that's the reason why the government reply score is slightly lower than the opposition reply in that matter. So yeah, next one. Yeah, so I think that's all for the brief on the judging brief and also the scores on each speakers coming from the substantive speaker and also the reply speaker. If you still have any more questions related to this judging brief, feel free to ask me or Muti or Indy and also Daud. So yeah, representing the Chief Education Panel, we would like to wish best of luck for everyone and see you in IVED 2022. Thank you very much for your cooperation and listening to this judging brief. And yeah, may the odds be ever in your favor. Thank you, everyone.